We now have the preliminary NTSB report on the King Air B100 crash in Coral Springs, Florida. And there's a particular detail in here, one specific point that really stands out. It's something investigators don't typically highlight unless it matters. And when we combine this with the flight path, ATC exchanges, weather, and the systems on board this aircraft, it paints a much clearer picture of what may have unfolded during those final minutes. And to understand why this new detail is so significant, we need to go back to the ramp at Fort Lauderdale and follow this flight from the very beginning. This is William, and welcome to BlackboxAnalyst. This flight wasn't a pleasure trip. It was a relief mission. On the morning of November 10th, a group from a local church arrived with supplies for hurricane victims in Jamaica: tarps, flashlights, tools, screws, and a generator that was carried aboard without fuel, and were planning to load roughly 1,000 pounds of cargo, which the pilot had told them was the limit. But when they got to the airplane, they noticed the pilot had already loaded about 200 pounds of his own gear behind the pilot seat. Not a problem by itself, but it's part of the weight picture. The cargo was passed inside through the rear door while the pilot arranged it. The generator was placed in the aft baggage compartment and properly secured to the airframe with webbing. Good practice. None of it was strapped down. Boxes, tools, and supplies were placed on the cabin seats and footwells. A photograph reviewed by investigators clearly shows these items sitting unsecured. So right away, we have an aircraft carrying close to its intended payload: full fuel, 282 gallons of Jet A, and a cabin full of items that could shift during turbulence or maneuvering. This is not speculation. This is directly stated in the NTSB preliminary report. Now, a quick word about the airplane itself. This King Air B100 was significantly upgraded in 2024. New Garmin G6 HUD TXI displays, a GTN 750XI navigator, a GI 275 standby attitude indicator, and notably, a new S-Tech 3100 autopilot with brand new pitch, roll, and yaw servos. And that is important because the B100 trims differently from most King Airs. Instead of using a small trim tab on the elevator, the entire horizontal stabilizer moves to provide pitch trim. That system feels different, behaves differently, and reacts differently during any kind of malfunction. This aircraft had undergone extensive avionics work, was flown regularly afterward, and, at least according to the evidence available so far, was in normal operating condition on the morning of the accident. With the airplane loaded, fueled, and buttoned up, they taxied out for departure on runway 27. At 10:14:26 a.m., the King Air departed Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport and began a climb, initiating a right turn toward the northwest. The rate of climb averaged about 1,000 feet per minute but fluctuated up to 2,800 feet per minute at times. Nothing unusual for a King Air in this configuration. At around 4,000 feet, the aircraft leveled off. Now, here's where the weather matters. Earlier that morning, a cold front had passed across the region. Satellite images show a band of cumulus clouds draped over the accident area. So, shortly after departure, the airplane entered IMC and stayed inside the clouds during the initial heading changes. ATC first instructed a turn to 120 degrees. The pilot acknowledged. Then a turn to 90 degrees. Again, acknowledged. Everything sounding routine. But during this turn toward 90 degrees, the aircraft began accelerating from about 150 knots to roughly 200 knots. The airplane also began to descend. This is where things depart from normal. ATC called the aircraft November 0 Hotel Golf, climbing. There was no spoken reply. Instead, only heavy breathing and grunting came over the frequency. Not helpful, but very telling. Now, when you hear something like that, there are two broad possibilities: pilot incapacitation of some kind, the pilot physically fighting the controls due to unexpected forces. The descent continued to increase. Airspeed increased further, reaching about 270 knots. The aircraft was still in IMC, so the pilot had no visual reference to the outside world. Only a few seconds later, the King Air broke out from the cloud base, already in a steep, nose-down attitude. Multiple security cameras captured the last seconds as the aircraft descended at roughly a 45-degree angle, right wing low, straight into a pond in a residential area. There were no signs of smoke, no fire, no vapor trail, and both engines sounded normal in the footage. The aircraft appeared intact until impact, meaning there is no evidence so far of an in-flight structural failure. The aircraft fragmented severely due to the impact forces. and investigators recovered the stabilizer, engine, and propeller components for detailed examination. So, to summarize the flight path: normal takeoff, normal climb, normal ATC responses. Then, during a heading change, rapid acceleration, sudden descent, pilot stops responding, audible signs of physical strain, and the aircraft enters a fully developed dive. The key question becomes, what changed inside that airplane during the turn in IMC? And this is where the important detail revealed by the NTSB comes back into the picture. The preliminary report specifically calls out that all of the cargo, except the generator, was unsecured. This isn't speculation or rumor. This is documented with photographic evidence. Why does that matter? Let's consider the environment. The aircraft was in IMC, inside a cloud band associated with a cold front. These cloud bands often contain light to moderate turbulence. Nothing extreme, but enough to cause a jolt or shift in a turn. Now imagine a cabin full of heavy, dense boxes, tools, flashlights, tarps sitting loosely on seats. During a turn in turbulence, what do those items want to do? They want to slide forward. They want to gather in the lower part of the cabin. And if enough of them move at the same time, the center of gravity can shift forward. A forward shift in CG pushes the nose down. It increases control forces. It can overwhelm the pilot, particularly if it happens unexpectedly inside a cloud. Combine that with the B100 stabilizer trim system, and you can get a scenario where the pilot is suddenly fighting substantial forward pressure on the yoke, and at high speeds, those forces become tremendous. The heavy breathing and grunting on the radio suddenly make more sense in that light. Now, I'm not saying that a cargo shift definitely happened, and we can't conclude that this caused the accident, but the NTSB does not highlight unsecured cargo unless it is relevant to the investigative direction. In other words, this is not just a footnote. This is a signpost. And while this alone may not fully explain the steep dive, it does help explain why investigators want to focus closely on weight distribution, cabin loading, and movement during turbulence. But there is still more to consider. Even though unsecured cargo is now a major point of interest, investigators will not limit themselves to a single theory. Several other factors remain plausible, based on the evidence. First, we have the possibility of a runaway pitch trim or autopilot servo malfunction. With the STEC 3100 installed recently, and with brand new servos, there's always the potential for an unexpected activation or runaway. In an aircraft that trims with a full moving horizontal stabilizer, that can produce a sudden and powerful pitch change. If the trim ran nose down, or if a pitch servo fault created unexpected movement, the pilot would have felt it immediately, and the forces could have been significant enough to cause exactly the kind of heavy breathing we heard. Second, pilot incapacitation remains on the table. A medical event can happen suddenly, and without the cockpit voice recorder, none is required on this aircraft. We don't have a full picture. But incapacitation alone does not explain the rapid acceleration or the aircraft's attitude coming out of the clouds. So this is possible, but unlikely to be the sole factor. Third, weather. The radar returns showed 5 to 20 decibel Z light to moderate echoes. Perfectly flyable, but enough to introduce small bursts of turbulence that could combine with any of the other problems we've mentioned. Finally, there is nothing in the report indicating engine failure, fuel starvation, smoke, fire, or an in-flight breakup. Both engines appear to have been functioning normally, right up to the moment of impact. Investigators are now reviewing the trim components, servos, avionics, and recovered cabin contents. They will reconstruct weight and balance and test the mechanical systems. Only the final report will tell us the definitive cause, but the preliminary data already gives us a very helpful framework. This was a tragic accident involving two people participating in a mission to help others. But every time the NTSB releases a preliminary report, we get another chance to learn. Unsecured cargo in a pressurized cabin is not harmless. Even a moderate disturbance can shift weight in a way that affects aircraft handling. And in a King Air, especially one with a full moving stabilizer trim system, any sudden pitch change can rapidly become unrecoverable if multiple factors line up at once. As always, we need to wait for the final report to know exactly what happened, but we can already see why investigators are examining the trim system, servo operation, pilot workload in IMC, and of course, the unsecured cargo. If you'd like to see our earlier analysis of this crash, including the ATC audio from the day it happened. Click the video appearing on the screen now, or use the link in the description. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.